You know this story. April 14th, 1865. A theater in Washington. A president in a rocking chair, laughing at a line he had probably heard before, on the first easy night the country had known in 4 years. You know how it ends. What you don't know is that 4 days earlier, a man stood in the president's office, gripped his hand, and made him promise not to go. Not to the theater, not anywhere, not until he got back. The president laughed it off, the way he laughed off everything this particular man said, because this man had been saying some version of the same sentence for 4 years, and for 4 years nothing had happened, and a man who cries wolf 4 years running starts to sound, even to the people who love him, like exactly that. His name was Ward Hill Lamon. He was 50 miles away in Richmond when the shot was fired. He would spend the rest of his life, all 28 years of it, trying to explain to people, and mostly to himself, that 50 miles was the only thing standing between Abraham Lincoln and a bodyguard who would have put his own body in front of the blade. He was not believed when it mattered. He was believed by everyone forever, the moment it stopped mattering. This is the story of the man who saw it coming, said so, in writing, more than once, and was still 50 miles away when it happened anyway. Understand who Ward Hill Lamon was before you understand what he failed to stop. He was not a soldier assigned to Lincoln. He was not hired. Nobody in the War Department put him on a payroll to stand between the president and a bullet. He appointed himself. That distinction matters more than it sounds like it should. He met Lincoln in Danville, Illinois, in the early 1850s, 2 lawyers riding the same judicial circuit through prairie towns that didn't have hotels so much as rooms above stores. They shared beds on the road, the way circuit lawyers did in that country, because there was 1 bed and 2 men, and nobody thought twice about it. Lamon was Lincoln's law partner for 4 years. He was 6'4", built like a barn door, and by his own account, carried something close to 60 pounds of armament on his person at any given time. 2 Colt revolvers, a Bowie knife, brass knuckles, and, depending on who you ask, a blackjack he'd made himself. He sang. That detail gets left out of most tellings, and it shouldn't. Lamon had a fine baritone voice and a banjo, and on the long, dull evenings of circuit riding, he would sing sentimental ballads while Lincoln, half his size and twice as sad-eyed, sat and listened. Whatever else the 2 of them were to each other, they were also just 2 men in Illinois who liked each other's company, for years, before either of them mattered to history. When Lincoln went to Washington in 1861, he took Lamon with him. Officially, Lamon became United States Marshal for the District of Columbia, a position that involved running the district's prisons and not, on paper, guarding the president. Unofficially, everyone in Washington understood what Lamon actually was. Consider the picture. A United States Marshal, sworn to oversee jails and serve writs, instead spending his evenings walking the perimeter of the executive mansion to check whether the guards were where they were supposed to be. Sometimes, when a rumor of danger reached him, he did not go home at all. He lay down across the floor outside Lincoln's bedroom door and slept there, armed, so that anyone who wanted to reach the president in the night would have to step over Ward Hill Lamon first. That is not a job description. That is a man who had already decided, privately, what he would do if it came to it. He had reason to decide it early. In February of 1861, before Lincoln had even been sworn in, the detective Allan Pinkerton uncovered a plot to kill the president-elect as his train passed through Baltimore. Lincoln was smuggled through the city in the dead of night on a different train than the one that was publicly scheduled, and the one man chosen to ride with him through that darkness, armed, was Lamon. Pinkerton wanted Lincoln unarmed, insisting it would look wrong for the new president to enter the Capitol carrying weapons. Lamon offered Lincoln a revolver and a Bowie knife anyway. That was 4 years before Ford's Theater. Lamon had been building the same argument, in one form or another, since the very first night the danger became real. Now consider what 4 years of war did to that argument. Every week, mail arrived at the White House. Some of it was ordinary correspondence, petitions, job requests, complaints about troop movements through a farmer's cornfield. Some of it described, in detail, how the writer intended to end Abraham Lincoln's life. Poison, a bullet through a window, a knife in a crowd. One letter arrived with a drawing of a coffin. The White House staff kept a file of these. By 1864, it held more than 80 threats, specific enough to be taken seriously by the men whose job it was to take such things seriously. Lincoln was not one of those men. He had a way of talking about his own death that unsettled the people around him precisely because it was so calm. When Lafayette Baker, the government's chief detective, tried to walk him through the latest plots against him, Lincoln would wave it off with something close to a joke. "Well, Baker," he'd say, "what do they want to kill me for? If they kill me, they will run the risk of getting a worse man." It is a good line. It got a laugh. Most times he used it. It also happens to be the exact sentence of a man who has made peace with a possibility other people around him have not. Lamon had not made peace with it. Lamon spent 4 years trying to talk Lincoln out of the habits that made him easy to kill, walking to the War Department alone at night, riding unguarded to the soldiers' home, sitting in a theater box with the curtains open and the door unlocked. He wrote Lincoln memos. He wrote him letters when he wasn't in the room to say it to his face. At one point, his warnings grew frequent enough and insistent enough that Lincoln turned to his Secretary of the Interior in front of Lamon and said, not unkindly, that this particular friend was a monomaniac on the subject of his safety. A monomaniac. That was the word the President of the United States used, laughing, about the one man in Washington who had correctly diagnosed how he was going to die. There is a kind of loneliness, specific to being right too early and too often. Every prophet who turns out to be correct spends the years before the proof accumulating a reputation as a bore. Consider what 4 years of that loneliness actually looked like in practice. Because it was not abstract, it was Lamon showing up at the War Department to argue, again, that the president should not walk to the telegraph office alone after dark. It was Lamon drafting a formal letter in 1864, a document that survives, laying out, point by point, why he believed the current security arrangements around the president were inadequate, and delivering it not as a rumor but as a considered professional opinion from the man whose unofficial job this had become. It was Lamon, more than once, physically inserting himself between Lincoln and a crowd he judged too thick, too unpredictable, too easy to hide a man with a pistol inside. Each time, the crowd thinned out and Lincoln walked home unharmed, and each time, the next warning landed a little softer than the one before it. That is how vigilance gets worn down, not by one dramatic dismissal, but by 100 small ones, each perfectly reasonable on its own, each one sanding the warning smoother until it stopped drawing blood. There was a dream. Lincoln told it to several people in the days before his death, and he told a fuller version of it to Lamon specifically, sometime in early April, in the White House, in a mood Lamon would later describe as unusually somber for a man who had just watched his army finally win the war. In the dream, Lincoln wandered through the White House, hearing the sound of mourners weeping. He followed the sound from room to room until he reached the East Room, and there, laid out on a catafalque, surrounded by soldiers standing guard and a crowd gazing at the corpse with sorrowful reverence, was a body. He asked one of the soldiers who was dead. The soldier told him, the president. He had been killed by an assassin. Lincoln woke up. He told Lamon the dream almost as a curiosity, the kind of story a tired man tells at the end of a long week, because it's still rattling around in his head, and he wants it out of there. He even joked about it afterward, the same way he joked about everything that frightened the people who loved him. Lamon did not find it funny. Lamon wrote it down. It survives today only because he did. You are allowed to be skeptical of a story like this. Dreams reported after the fact have a way of sharpening themselves in the retelling, and Lamon was, among other things, a man who would go on to build a career partly out of having known Lincoln better than anyone else alive. Take the dream for exactly what it is worth to you. But notice the shape of what happened next, regardless of what you believe about a dream. A man who had spent 4 years warning his friend about a coffin was told, by that friend, about a coffin, and 4 days later he was sent away. Thursday, April 13th, 1865. 2 days before Good Friday, Lee had surrendered 6 days earlier at Appomattox. Washington was still lit up from the celebrations. Bonfires, brass bands, strangers embracing in the street. 4 years of accumulated dread finally allowed to leave the body all at once. Lincoln called Lamon into his office and gave him an assignment. He wanted Lamon to go to Richmond, the fallen Confederate capital, and assess the mood of the city under occupation, how much resistance the Union troops were meeting, whether the president himself might safely visit in the coming days. It was a real assignment. It was also, whether Lincoln intended it this way or not, the kind of task you hand to a friend who has become exhausting to have in the room. Go check on Richmond. Go be useful somewhere 50 miles away for a few days. Lamon accepted the assignment the way a marshal accepts an order from his president. Then, before he left, he did the thing he had been doing for 4 years, one more time, because it was the only tool he had. He asked Lincoln to promise him something. Not to attend any public gathering, and specifically, not to go to the theater, until Lamon returned. By some accounts, he did not simply ask. He gripped the president's hand and would not let it go until he had something like a commitment. He had watched Lincoln slip his official guard for years, leaving the mansion on foot, walking to the telegraph office alone late at night, riding to the soldier's home with nothing between himself and the road but a horse. Every time, nothing happened. Every time, the nothing made the next warning sound more foolish than the last. Lincoln gave him something. Whatever it was, a yes, a nod, a laugh and a promise made mostly to end the conversation. It was enough for Lamon to leave Washington, believing he had bought 4 days of safety with a handshake. Before he left the city, he had a pass written up allowing him through Union lines to reach the occupied capital. Lincoln signed it himself. That single sheet of paper still exists. It sits today in the Huntington Library in California, and the people who catalog such things have given it an unofficial name, the kind of name that only makes sense once you know how the story ends. They call it Lincoln's death warrant, not because of anything written on it, because of what it sent away from Washington on the one night it mattered. Friday, April 14th, 1865. Good Friday. 50 miles south, in Richmond, Ward Hill Lamon was doing exactly what he had been sent to do, walking the streets of a defeated city, gauging the temperature of a population that had lost a war 6 days earlier, writing down what he saw for a report he would deliver to a president he believed he had made safe until his return. In Washington, the day moved the way ordinary good days move, which is to say, almost invisibly, one unremarkable hour folding into the next. Lincoln held a cabinet meeting that morning. General Grant attended. The talk was of what came next, how to bring the South back into a country it had just finished trying to leave, what mercy might look like now that the shooting had stopped. People who were in that room later remembered Lincoln as unusually light that day, almost buoyant, a man who had spent 4 years carrying something that had finally, for one afternoon, set it down. That afternoon, Mary Lincoln began arranging a small theater party for the evening. General and Mrs. Grant were invited first and initially accepted, then changed their minds. A train to see their children in New Jersey took priority, and by the middle of the afternoon, their acceptance had quietly become a regret. Others were asked, others declined. It was Good Friday, the most solemn day on the Christian calendar, and respectable Washington did not spend Good Friday at a comedy. By late afternoon, the President and First Lady had collected a string of polite refusals, and no company for the evening. Understand what was missing from that room by early evening, and understand it precisely. The 2 men whose actual job, formal or self-appointed, was to stand near Abraham Lincoln in a crowd, were both somewhere else. William Crook, one of Lincoln's regular guards, had already finished his shift. Ward Hill Lamon, the other, was 50 miles away, writing a report nobody would ever get to read to him in person. In their place, the War Department assigned a Metropolitan Police officer named John Parker to accompany the presidential party that evening. Parker had a service record that, charitably, gave no one particular confidence. prior complaints, a reputation for drink, nothing that suggested the kind of man who slept across a doorway to keep his principals safe. Lincoln went to the theater with the guard the city could spare on short notice, instead of the guard who had spent 4 years making a religion out of not letting this happen. Consider the arithmetic of that particular evening, laid out plainly. A president who had shrugged off 80 documented threats, a dream he had told and laughed about, to the one man who did not laugh. A promise extracted 4 days earlier by a friend who was, at that exact hour, 50 miles away believing the promise was still good. A hastily assigned officer who would, within the hour, leave his post outside the box entirely to get a closer view of the play from the seats below, or to get a drink at the saloon next door. Accounts differ, and it no longer matters which. None of these facts, alone, killed Abraham Lincoln. All of them together left a door unguarded. Consider, too, the smaller irony sitting inside that theater box before anything had gone wrong at all. Major Henry Rathbone was there that night only because Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, uneasy about the thin security around the president, had asked him at the last moment to accompany the party. A young officer, engaged to be married, given no formal instructions beyond his own good judgment and whatever instinct he could summon in a crisis he had no training for. He was not a bodyguard. He was a substitute for one, found in an afternoon, standing in for a man who had spent 4 years building himself specifically for this exact evening and was, instead, 50 miles away. Rathbone would do more that night, with less preparation and no weapon but his own arm, than most men could reasonably have been asked to do. He was cut nearly to the bone trying to hold a door and a man both at once. It was not enough, and it was never going to be enough, because one determined and improvising officer is not a substitute for 4 years of purpose-built vigilance. That is not a criticism of Rathbone. It is a measurement of exactly what Lamon's absence actually cost. Not a failure of nerve in the box, but the absence, before the night even began, of the one man who had spent 4 years training specifically to prevent it from beginning that way at all. You know what happened in that box. You do not need it described to you again, and this is not that kind of telling. A man crossed a hallway that should have had someone standing in it. A shot was fired from a range close enough that powder burned the president's hair. A knife came out when a young officer who was not supposed to be the last line of defense tried to be one anyway, and very nearly bled to death proving it. What matters for this story is what was happening 50 miles south while all of it unfolded. Lamon did not know. There was no way for him to know, not for hours. Telegraph lines carried the news toward Richmond at the speed telegraph allowed, and Ward Hill Lamon spent some portion of the worst night of his life going about ordinary business in an occupied city, entirely unaware that the promise he had extracted 4 days earlier had already been broken, and that the man who broke it was by that hour already dying in a room too small for the number of people standing in it. When the news finally reached him, it did not arrive as a rumor to be doubted. It arrived as confirmed fact, the president shot, the president not expected to live, and somewhere underneath that fact, unspoken but unmissable to anyone who knew the last conversation he'd had with Lincoln, was the second fact that would define the rest of Lamon's life. He had asked for exactly this not to happen. He had been told, in effect, not to worry. He had left the city believing his friend was safe because his friend had said so. There is a specific and terrible arithmetic to grief when you have spent years being the person who warned about the exact thing that then happened. It does not console you to have been right. It does not feel like vindication. It feels like proof, delivered 4 days too late to be of any use, that the 50 miles between you and the person you loved were the only 50 miles in the world that mattered, and you were the one who agreed to travel them. Lamon later wrote down what he felt in that moment, in language that has survived him by more than a century. "As God is my judge," he wrote, "I believe if I had been in the city, it would not have happened, and had it, I know that the assassin would not have escaped the town." Read that sentence slowly. It is not written by a man comforting himself. It is written by a man convicting himself, using the only evidence he had, which was his own certainty about what he would have done with his body if he had been standing where his body was supposed to be standing. He came back to Washington as fast as the roads and the rivers allowed, and he arrived to a city that had, in his absence, already begun turning the worst night of his life into the founding trauma of a nation. There was no role left for him to play in saving anyone. That work was finished, badly, before he ever got the telegram. What was left for Ward Hill Lamon was smaller and, in its own way, harder. There was a body that needed to travel more than 1,000 miles home to Illinois, through city after city that wanted its own viewing, its own procession, its own hour of collective grief before releasing the train to the next stop. Lamon organized it. He and his deputies arranged the final details of the funeral train, the route, the security, the 1,000 small logistics of moving a martyred president across half a continent, while an entire country lined the tracks to watch him pass. It was, in its way, the last and largest act of protection he ever performed for Abraham Lincoln, not keeping him alive, which he had failed to do, but making sure that what remained of him got where it was going, with the dignity a friend could still provide. 4 days too late for the thing that mattered, and exactly on time for the thing that came after. He resigned his commission as Marshal less than 2 months later. The record does not show him giving an elaborate reason. It did not need one. A man does not typically want to keep drawing a federal salary in a city built around a job he believes he failed at in the one moment it counted. He went home to Illinois. Consider what he carried with him on that trip, beyond luggage. Not just grief. The country had plenty of that to go around that summer, an entire nation in black crepe, and Lamon's grief would not have looked, from the outside, especially different from anyone else's. What he carried that almost nobody else in America carried was specificity. Most mourners in 1865 were grieving an idea, a president, a symbol, the end of a war stitched to the death of the man who'd won it. Lamon was grieving a broken promise he had personally negotiated, 4 days before it was broken, in a room with a door he could have simply refused to walk through until he got a better answer than the one he got. That is a different kind of weight to carry back to Illinois. Everyone else in that summer's funeral crowds could tell themselves, honestly, that there was nothing they personally could have done. Lamon could not tell himself that, and by his own written account, in the decades that followed, he never really tried. Understand what came after, because this is the part the anniversary pieces leave out, the part that turns a footnote into a life sentence. Ward Hill Lamon lived another 28 years. He practiced law. He remarried after the death of his first wife, and had children he by all accounts loved without complication. He was on the surface a man who survived a national tragedy and went on to live an ordinary American life of modest professional success. A law partnership, a run for Congress he lost, a nomination for governor he didn't get. He was also, for every one of those 28 years, the man who left. You cannot fully separate the two facts. In 1872, 7 years after the assassination, Lamon published a biography of Lincoln, co-written with a partner's son, drawing on decades of private notes and personal recollection nobody else alive possessed. It should have been the definitive account, the one written by the man who had actually shared a bed with Lincoln on the Illinois circuit, who had ridden with him through the Baltimore plot, who had slept across his bedroom door. Instead, it scandalized nearly everyone who read it. Lamon's Lincoln was not the marble saint the country had spent 7 years constructing. He was profane, melancholic, superstitious, a man who believed in dreams and omens and told off-color jokes at inappropriate moments. In short, a real and complicated human being, described honestly by the one friend willing to say so in print. The public reaction was fierce. Critics accused Lamon of tearing down a national icon for profit. Some accused him of being disloyal to a friend who could no longer defend himself. Nobody, reading those reviews, seemed to notice or care that the book had been written by the one man in America who had earned the right to describe Lincoln as he actually was, because he was also the one man in America who had begged that same Lincoln, in person, 4 days before his death, to please be more careful, and had been told, gently, that he worried too much. Consider what it must have cost Lamon to publish that book at all. He was not simply writing history. He was defending, to a country that would not listen, the version of Lincoln he had actually tried to protect. Flawed, mortal, aware of his own danger, and strangely at peace with it. Instead of the polished martyr, the nation preferred to mourn. He was arguing, in effect, that the real Lincoln had been the kind of man who dismissed his own bodyguard's warnings with a joke, and that this detail mattered, that it explained something, that it was not disrespect to say so out loud. Nobody wanted to hear that the martyr had laughed off the warning. They wanted the martyr. Lamon had the man. The book sold poorly, at first, and the friendships it cost him sold worse. Robert Todd Lincoln, the president's surviving son, was said to have been deeply unhappy with its contents, unhappy enough that Lamon's later, gentler manuscript, the one his daughter Dorothy would eventually finish and publish after his death as Recollections of Lincoln, reads in places like a man trying to make amends for a portrait he still, underneath the apology, believed was true. He softened some passages, he restored some of the marble. He did not, in the end, take back the dream, or the warnings, or the fact that he had begged and been laughed at. Some truths, once written down by the one man who lived them, refuse to be unwritten no matter how much later peace requires it. He carried the guilt in smaller ways too, the kind that don't make it into biographies because nobody thought to write them down until it was too late to ask him directly. People who knew Lamon in his later years described a man who returned to the subject of April 1865 more than most people return to their worst memory, not obsessively, exactly, but reliably, the way a tongue returns to a broken tooth. He would talk, when asked, and sometimes when not asked, about the pass Lincoln had signed for him, the one now sitting in an archive with a nickname he never chose and would not have liked. He would talk about the dream Lincoln told him, and you can hear, in the second-hand accounts of these conversations, a man still trying to work out whether he should have taken it as the warning it turned out to be, or whether that was hindsight doing what hindsight always does, dressing up a coincidence in the costume of prophecy. Mostly, though, he came back to the arithmetic of the distance. 50 miles, a single night, a promise he believed he had that turned out not to be one. He never fully forgave the city of Washington for what happened in his absence, and in a smaller, quieter, more corrosive way, it is difficult to read what survives of him and conclude that he ever fully forgave himself either. He died in Martinsburg, West Virginia, in May of 1893, 65 years old. 28 years is a long time to live inside a single sentence you wrote to yourself in April of 1865. I believe, if I had been in the city, it would not have happened. Long enough that the sentence outlived nearly everyone who might have argued him out of believing it. Long enough that by the time he died, there was almost nobody left alive who remembered him as anything other than the man who wasn't there. Here is the part of the story most tellings skip entirely, because it does not fit the shape of a tragedy. It is a fact, and it deserves to sit here plainly, without decoration. Every account we have, Lincoln's own dismissive jokes, the cabinet meeting notes, the letters from other friends who found Lamon's warnings tiresome, agrees on one thing that history has quietly buried under the weight of what came after. Ward Hill Lamon was correct. Not correct in some vague, hindsight, everybody could have predicted it way. Correct specifically. Correct about the theater. Correct about the danger of an unguarded evening among crowds. Correct enough that he tried to extract a formal promise about it 4 days before it happened, and correct enough that the promise, when broken, killed his best friend within hours. He was not believed because being right too early, too often, about a danger nobody else can see, does not read as wisdom while it is happening. It reads as anxiety. It reads as a monomania, to use the president's own word. The people around Lincoln had watched Lamon sound this alarm for 4 years without incident, and 4 years of false alarms will erode the credibility of even a warning that turns out, on the one night it counts, to have been entirely accurate. That is the specific cruelty embedded in this story, and it is worth sitting with rather than rushing past. The system that should have protected Abraham Lincoln did not fail because nobody saw the danger coming. It failed because the one man who saw it clearly enough to act on it had, through years of vigilance nobody else could sustain, made himself sound like exactly the kind of person you stop listening to. There is a pattern here that reaches well past one man in 1 century. Every institution that has ever failed to prevent a catastrophe it was warned about tends, afterward, to produce the same quiet finding, that somebody, somewhere, had said this exact thing might happen, and had been managed, politely, out of the room. The warning is rarely the missing piece. The missing piece is nearly always a system's capacity to keep hearing the same warning without becoming numb to it. Lamon's tragedy was not that he failed to see the danger. It is that seeing it clearly, for 4 consecutive years, without a single confirming disaster, was itself the thing that quietly disqualified him from being taken seriously on the one night the disaster finally came. Historians have spent a century and a half asking what might have stopped John Wilkes Booth that night. A locked door, a competent guard, a president who preferred safety to spectacle. Fewer have asked the harder question sitting underneath all of it. What does it actually take for a society to keep believing its own alarm system, once that system has cried wolf enough times to earn the label? Lamon never got a satisfying answer to that question, because the country never had to give him one. It simply buried him, decades later, under the weight of having been right, and moved on to mourning the man he couldn't save, instead of reckoning with the man who tried. The past still exists. Lincoln's handwriting, his signature, a single sheet of paper authorizing one friend to travel 50 miles south at the exact moment that friend was most needed, 50 miles north. It sits behind glass now in a library in California, catalogued, preserved, correctly lit, properly labeled. The same institutional fate that eventually claims every object that survives a tragedy long enough to become a relic instead of a possession. The unofficial name attached to it was given by people who came much later, people who had the advantage every historian has, and no participant in the actual events ever gets. They already knew how the story ended before they had to decide what to call the paper. Lincoln's death warrant, signed, ironically, by the one man who did not believe he needed a bodyguard on the one night he most obviously did. Ward Hill Lamon carried a version of that same irony for 28 years, in a place no library could ever put behind glass. He had spent 4 years building himself into the single most vigilant man in Washington, 60 pounds of armament, a body across a doorway, a promise extracted with a grip that would not let go until he got an answer. And on the one night, none of it would have been enough unless he was physically present to use it. He was 50 miles away, doing exactly what his president had asked of him, believing, right up until the telegram, that he had done his job. He had done his job. He had done it for 4 straight years, correctly, exhaustingly, at real cost to how people saw him. He was simply not there for the one night the job needed doing in person. He spent the rest of his life understanding that those 2 facts could both be true at once, and that neither one would ever cancel out the other.